2026 marks the 60th anniversary of the Second Doctor, and I felt this is a very important milestone to mark. So I will be covering 3 of his stories throughout this year. I know, really stretching myself there. First, for 2 stories that provide his encounters with perhaps his most quintessential villain, this story, The Abominable Snowmen, and its sequel, The Web of Fear, a bit later in the spring. And then later in the year, I'll be covering the 10-part epic finale to his era, The War Games. The importance of the Second Doctor to the legacy of Doctor Who cannot be underestimated. I already went over this to a great extent when I looked at the Power of the Daleks, so I won't repeat myself too much. But for as much as we take the replacement of the lead actor of the show for granted nowadays, to the point where the current showrunner has done it in a throwaway placeholder fashion twice now, back then it was a huge risk, and an enormous one to have the new Doctor be such a radical departure from the old. But its success, in no small part thanks to the casting of Patrick Troughton, who was simply a phenomenal actor, allowed the show to have an established mechanism to renew and reinvent itself, and is certainly the reason we're still here over 60 years later. But it should also not be underestimated how much of a success it was in itself. A show which had been slowly declining suddenly found a new lease of life. And yeah, while the heights of Dalek mania were not reached again, the direction of travel remained downwards throughout until the reinvention into the 1970s, Doctor Who was nevertheless steadily successful throughout most of Troughton's run. While a lot of this were creative choices and solid leadership, in contrast to the John Wiles disaster that had come smack bang in the middle of Hartnell's era, there's no denying that Troughton's Doctor engaged with audiences quickly. Therefore, 60 years is not just a commemoration of the impact this change made on the show, but simply just this memorable, sublimely performed Doctor and the adventures he had. Which brings us to The Abominable Snowmen, which comes in Season 5, Troughton's middle season, also known as the Base Under Siege season, which is fair given that only 2 stories in the whole season did not follow that particular setup. One of them being the season opener, The Tomb of the Cybermen, and even that's somewhat debatable. I'd say it isn't, but some would say it is. And the other, the format breaking The Enemy of the World, which definitely isn't. And despite most of the stories being pretty solid, Base Under Siege as a format became very tired very quickly because it becomes impossible not to constantly hit the same beats. Base is threatened, Doctor and co turn up, initially mistrusted and blamed, then Doctor proves his worth, blah blah blah. You can vary the different way the characters work, of course. Clent, Robson and Jarvis are all essentially the same character, but with a few different shades. And the relationships can work differently, but in the end, you can only put a different spin on it so many times, and it becomes repetitive. The Abominable Snowmen is the first story in the season to be based on the Siege, true, but the format itself had originated earlier, with the first 2 Cyberman stories being the true originators, to the point where Hobson in the Moonbase had such a similar name to Robson and Fury from the Deep that they must have been taking the piss on purpose. This story, I think, manages to make it seem a bit more original than most for 2 reasons. Firstly, that the base isn't futuristic, or at least modern-day technological. This difference of setting creates very different dynamics, where the motivations for the base's inhabitants is not professional, but more about human needs. Secondly, the focus is far more on the people and the human drama than it is on some of the other stories. The base itself is not some technological plot point like the Ice Age prevention technology in the Ice Warriors, or the rig apparatus in Fury from the Deep. All that's being explored is the people inside, their allegiances, loyalties, faith, etc. That prevents it from feeling like a plot point and more like a human exploration, which definitely works well in keeping this feeling fresh and grounded. So while the story does have its flaws, it's overall a satisfying piece and one that uses its format well, probably better than most, I'd say. So to start exploring the story itself, it is obviously frequently the elephant in the room for 60 stories that the archive is incomplete. Season 5 has benefited the most from past recoveries over nearly half a century. When Junking ended in 1978, out of the 40 episodes that make up the season, just 2 were found to survive. Episode 3 of The Enemy of the World and Episode 6 of The Wheel in Space, both negatives randomly retained in the film library. And look where we are now and how far we've come. 2 complete stories, 2 more nearly complete stories, and only one of the others is having no episodes at all. Compared to Season 4, which was better represented in 1978, but has had only 3 recovered episodes since then, the difference is night and day. The Abominable Snowmen is not one of the bigger beneficiaries from this, however. The story sold to 7 regular Commonwealth buyers of the series, similar to much of Season 5. 4 sets of prints are believed to have been created, 1 to New Zealand, compared to having been destroyed in 1974, 1 to Gibraltar, which went onwards to Zambia. While its eventual fate is unrecorded, it certainly isn't at ZTV anymore, so probably destroyed. 1 to Hong Kong, which went onwards to Singapore, and then Nigeria. While its eventual fate is again unknown, the fact it wasn't sitting in that TV station with The Enemy in the World and The Web of Fear probably is a sign it's not around anymore. And then 1 to Australia, which, along with most Australian films, returned to the BBC in 1975, with the negatives reportedly being destroyed in 1974. So, unfortunately, it was a case of flamethrowing quite efficiently for this story, and indeed nothing remained in 1978. In 1982, a BBC employee bought a print of episode 2 from a film collector, which he promptly returned to the BBC, which gives us 1 out of the 6 episodes existing. Given the number of films that have gone walkies from that 1975 batch from Australia over the years, it's probably the existing print that came from that batch, with it having been opportunistically nabbed while the other episodes were destroyed. So we have that, 1 episode, and also a few film inserts, which are annoyingly from episode 2, but at least it means that the quality of the film sequences in the episode we watched today is far better than it otherwise would be, and indeed is notably so when you watch it when compared to the studio scenes. Now, I'm about to go into some properly anal stuff, so forgive me for indulging myself, but episode 2 is sometimes included in the list of incomplete existing episodes, because the sound for a line is missing. However, this error is included in all known off-air audios of this story, and was clearly a fault on the original master tape and was broadcast as such, and if the only way to complete an episode is to go back in time and actually film Patrick Troughton saying the line, then it's complete as far as I'm concerned. The sound people have fixed it for today's releases, as one of those things you wouldn't notice at all if you weren't listening for it, and that you'll never be able to unhear once you've noticed it. It's when the doctor says, "You were right about one thing, Victoria. Listen out closely, and as I said, you'll never unhear it." The story has also of course been animated. Now, as much as I appreciate the animations having been done, and understand their shortcomings are unavoidable because of time and budget constraints, because these full story animations are not meant to be reimaginings of the story rather than outright reconstruction, I have a policy of not using them for these reviews. Also, I wouldn't anyway for this one, because to be honest, in my view, it's one of the weaker ones. The animation still feels very flat, and the framing of many scenes is quite weak. Still, it's probably as good as we're ever going to get for most of this story, unless AI reaches a point where it can just recreate the whole thing, but let's not debate the pros and cons of such an approach. I wish this video to be slightly shorter than 8 hours long. Happily, the DVD also comes with an official reconstruction using the full set of telesnaps that exist, which can have Frazer Hines' narration over the top, which I always prefer over text descriptions and reconstructions, so it could be a lot worse. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's get going on the story itself. Firstly, with the production. Now, this is obviously harder than usual to assess with a missing story for pretty obvious reasons, but I have to try at least. This story was directed by Gerald Blake, who did this story and then near enough a whole decade later, The Invasion of Time. I don't understand either. In any case, it's difficult to really judge how well he does here, because most of the story is missing, and the one episode that isn't is not a particularly visual episode. There's a few bits of action here and there, but it's mostly about the interactions and the building of the mystery, so it's difficult to judge. Overall, I think he does okay there, whereas there are a few things worth mentioning. From what we can gather from episode 2, he does well with the location work, wisely putting the money on the screen to show the full landscape, not only of course giving a sense of scale to the piece, but also doing his best to convince us this is the Himalayas by the wise choices of his shots to emphasise the particular terrain. I'll get to location work shortly, but I think it was important to give it that right sense, and Blake manages it. He also does a fantastic job with the scene when Tom Nee goes to see the abbot and encounters Padmasambhava for the first time. He keeps it slow, deliberate, close on Tom Nee, and allows the power of the atmosphere in Padmasambhava's voice to crank the creepiness in the atmosphere up to 11. It really emphasises the otherworldliness of it so well. If the other scenes building up to him throughout the subsequent episodes were this good, then Blake did a terrific job of making Padmasambhava as effective a presence as he feels like in episode 2 and the reconstructions. Blake also does a great job throughout, and this is obvious even in the reconstructions, of maintaining the atmosphere of the piece, which is probably its biggest strength, that of isolation, paranoia, the bleakness of their fight for survival, etc. and so forth. We feel every moment of the danger and the characters' reactions to it, and that sense is portrayed in the pacing of performances. Even without the visuals, I can tell that. So overall, yeah, I think it did well here as much as I can glean, but obviously that gleaning is fairly limited. Other aspects of the production to talk about. A great decision that contributed further to that atmosphere was not to have any music at all, apart from the opening and closing titles, obviously. It's a small but good choice that adds to the bleakness of what's happening, and a simple feeling of isolation and makes everything feel all that smaller and tighter. It would have been a distraction and potentially mood killing if done wrong, so I think it was a bold but successful choice. I said I'd talk about the location shoot, so let's talk about a location shoot. To tell a story in the Himalayas, you need somewhere that looks a bit like the Himalayas, and aren't you glad you have me here to point out these things? The choice was Snowdonia in North Wales, which was a good one. It has tall, by British standards, mountains, steep hills, quite a bleak atmosphere while also being rather beautiful, and most importantly a lot closer to London than most of the other alternatives, so cheaper to get to, which was always important. Now, does this actually look like the Himalayas? Well, not really, but this was never going to be for two reasons. Firstly, it rained all the time, so they couldn't put fake snow down, which would have helped a bit, and secondly, well, it's Doctor Who. There was no way they were going to be able to afford to do anything better. So I think they did a good job of choosing somewhere that gave off the right impression. It's actually pretty close to where they would film the Five Doctors 16 years later, and the difference in how well it's used is night and day. There's no sense this is a rather pleasant place, incidentally being described as a hostile alien world. This is meant to be a hostile place, even though it's on Earth, but you know what I mean. And it definitely works in getting that across. At least that's what I can see in episode 2. Finally, it's worth discussing the design of the Yeti, because, in all honesty, this should look ridiculous. A giant furry bear type thing, as easy as how this could have ended up looking like something straight out of a pantomime. But it doesn't, it's actually quite effective, at least to me. I know a lot of people think they're cute. And despite looking a bit kitschy after 60 years, that comes with the price of admission. Two things help with this. First of all, how huge they are. They dwarf everyone and makes it so much more believable that they're this insanely strong, and makes them feel borderline unstoppable. Secondly, they aren't given a recognisable face, therefore there is less to anthropomorphise and less to identify with, and also allows its huge imposing size and power to speak for itself, rather than relying on any facial cues. So, while yes, it looks like a bloke in a giant fursuit, I think they are very effectively realised. This of course gives rise to my favourite fun fact about the story. Apparently one of the actors in the Yeti suit fell down the mountain during the filming, and all the cast and crew were horrified he'd been killed. Luckily, all the foam in the suit meant all he had was a bit of a headache despite falling down a fucking mountain, which is a costume design of a quality you just don't get anymore. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's get to the script. This story was written by Mervyn, Haisman and Henry Lincoln, who would subsequently write this story's sequel, The Web of Fear, and were also the original writers for the insane clusterfuck that would eventually become The Dominators, and that experience left a bit of a sour taste in the mouth for them, so that was it for the show, which is incidentally the same sour taste in the mouth anyone who's had to watch The Dominators has. They both went on to have varied writing careers, which for Lincoln included co-writing the non-fiction book, and non is in rather large quotation marks there, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which does not involve coconut banging knights, but is rather the text proposing the whole Jesus bloodline thing that eventually became the basis for the Da Vinci Code. Doctor Who really does have obscure connections to everything, doesn't it? Anyway, this story is a decent but flawed one, and I think part of the reason why that is that Haisman and Lincoln's script prioritises atmosphere and character over plot. Which just means the latter is frequently very shaky, but also means that the former becomes the forefront of the story, and its effectiveness is what is the primary driver of the story. We focus less on the Great Intelligence's silly and confusing plan, because in reality it's a backdrop, to put these characters in the right places and create a sense of isolation that drives it. It's partially what makes it so unique as a base under siege story, that it is less about the siege and more about the base. I'll start, however, with a plot and get it out of the way, because most of my criticisms have to do with that. Overall, I think it's fine. As in its overall conception, mysterious alien intelligence threatens Buddhist monastery, which has a connection to the Doctor's past. It's fine, and indeed it does have some interesting new angles to explore. And indeed, the Great Intelligence is a fantastic villain. Very alien and very different, and while I'll be complaining a lot about how badly defined its plan is, it in itself being badly defined is good. It should have that level of mystery to it. Indeed, I think to have menace, it needs to have that mystery. And to just explain it all away, or just turn it into Richard E. Grant's sneer at everyone like New Who did, would have been a colossal mistake. And indeed, as we'll get to, the way it is portrayed, entirely through Padmasambhava, is extremely effective. The problem is that his plan of possess a monk for a few centuries to take over a remote Himalayan mountain and then the world, and hope this particular monk being mates with a guy known for defeating evil villains doesn't come back to bite us on the arse, is not exactly the most watertight and makes it feel like a bit of an afterthought in the story. Which at times is fine, as I said, the important bit is the character and the thematic stuff, that's the centre of the story, but at other times, especially because the story's pace means that pretty much everything has to get a good focus, you just can't push any of it into the back, it does become a bit head-scratching. For instance, the Great Intelligence's plan is a bit ludicrous, as I mentioned before, but the lack of a real endgame to it feels like a bit of a glaring error, as it feels, as I said, first this remote Himalayan monastery, then the entire world, without feeling like we have any step 2 between this step 1 and step 3. And the resolution itself is actually very weak, it's probably the weakest part of the story. Just storm into the room and break shit until we break the right thing, which happens to be this pyramid that Travis saw earlier, which does... and destroying it makes the Great Intelligence disappear because, anyway. So, again, throughout much of the story it doesn't matter, because it's only a backdrop to other elements, but when it does come to a head it feels weaker than it should. Travis seeing the pyramid is a great scene because of how effective it is in creepiness factor and atmosphere and all that stuff, but in terms of the actual plot, unlike in Web, the pyramid's a little more than a MacGuffin, and that sort of demonstrates what I mean. The need to make the plot happen also stretches the characters a little out of place sometimes, which is a sure sign it was just being crowbarred into fit. Victoria's bizarre obsession with going to see the inner sanctum of the monastery feels out of place. She's not really meant to be, insatiably curious. That's not really her character. And to have such a bizarre fixation on it to the point of tricking Tom the over, it just feels like it's the only way the writers could think of to get her into the sanctum of Padmasambhava. Small things like that contribute to the feeling the plot is maybe a bit half-baked overall. Another thing to comment on is the pacing of the piece, and I think this is both a success and a failure at the same time. It is glacially slow, which on the one hand gives it the time it needs to build the characters, the atmosphere, a sense of danger and isolation, and doesn't feel like it needs to hurry or skim through any of these points, which very much works to its advantage, as what gives the story its unique feel and atmosphere that is one of its biggest strengths. On the other hand, though, it can get a bit tedious at times, a bit repetitive at other times, and most of the times the plot elements, as I said, don't work, are poorly placed and poorly paced as a result. I admit there was a bit of a rock and a hard place situation, where 4 episodes would have been insufficient to properly establish the atmosphere, but 6 just feels like it's dragging a bit at times, and they barely ever do 5-parters, and that was only by necessity, so yeah, I don't really think there was a way out here. It just sometimes just depends on the individual scene, and I definitely do appreciate the story taking its time overall, especially after 20 years of New Who showing how frustrating it can be when it goes the other way, but I think this needed to be handled with a little more care than it eventually was. But that's about it for the less successful stuff. Let's talk about what makes the story work. And as I said, atmosphere is its biggest strength. The setting of the monastery as this isolated, barren place, a long way away from any help that could be mustered, on its own does a great job of creating the bleak and isolated atmosphere that the story is based on. And this is enhanced by the paranoia and desperation that comes across in the character interactions. It all combines to give it this really effective bleak atmosphere, which is all the more enhanced by the lack of music, the occasional chants of the monks, great sound design in general, and of course in many places the pacing that allows the audience, and indeed the characters, to contemplate and thus keeps it in place. It never quite veers into hopelessness, which is good, because that's not what was called for in a story like that, but instead emphasises isolation and desperation, which not only creates this effective atmosphere, but enhances some of the other themes we'll get to shortly. So yeah, I think this is very effective, and also very difficult to describe, but if you watch the story you'll certainly get what I mean. A monastery, of course, comes with monks, which neatly brings us to the character stuff. Now, the big elephant in the room is that all these Tibetans are played by white guys, and even with the black and white making the makeup less obvious than it would be in colour, yeah, you can tell. In the end, how much that affects your enjoyment is up to you. You can decide it's deeply insulting enough to put you off the whole thing, or you can think there was a product at its time when it was not only acceptable but the norm, and helping the latter point is the portrayals are entirely respectable. This is not a Talons of Wenchang situation where the racism is mostly pretty deliberate. On the other hand, though, the 60s dime store Buddhism probably doesn't help that either, so in the end, I'm not really sure. I'm kind of just going to take the story as it is because I'm not really sure what else to do with it, but I won't tell anyone else what to think here. I'm just pointing out this is a factor. So as I said, I think I'm personally willing to look past it just because I'm not really sure what to think. I'd rather focus on the things I do like. And it helps that if the actors had been replaced, there were performances I would have missed, particularly Kree Song and Padma Sambhavar, and it puts an asterisk on the stuff that works exceptionally well on the page, but again, I think for the most part I'll look past it. Now, it's worth pointing out that this is not a huge cast filled with hugely fleshed out characters. Most of the monks are not hugely developed, but that's actually okay, because it means the focus is where it needs to be and we don't get distracted by these other guys. Most of them have few traits, and their interactions with Kree Song in particular are designed to use these traits to further his character arc. It sensibly focuses on those who it needs to focus on. The Abbot, for instance, is a plot point character and nothing else, but because it is a plot that does great work to further the characters of both Padma Sambhavar and Kree Song, we can forgive it. The most prominent of the minor monk characters is Tomni, who is the young monk who quickly becomes the ally of the Doctor and his companions, but is frustrated by them as well. Which I like, because you do tend to get in Based on the Sea stories the base member who immediately trusts the Doctor and is always their ally throughout, in contrast to the leader who distrusts them, and to be honest is frequently a bit lazy and formulaic. But here, while Tomni does become their ally, they also annoy him by not listening to him when he tries to instruct them, as while he appreciates the Doctor in returning the holy bell or whatever, it's loyalty to his monastery and to his duty. It's a small arc of him learning the balance between that loyalty and trust in his instincts. It's small, but I don't think it needs to be bigger, and I think it works. The main monk, however, is Kree Song, and I think he is how you do a Base Under Siege leader right. He follows the same beats as you'd expect, initially mistrustful of the Doctor and accusing him of being the problem, before learning through experience to trust him, etc. and so forth. That's fairly standard, but it's the means of doing so that make this a successful character arc. A lot of the time these Bases leader stories are driven by the plot and reacting to events, and while obviously you can't avoid that entirely, Kree Song's arc is driven by his character. Throughout the entire story, he is motivated by his loyalty and duty to the other monks. His desire to protect them and the monastery, and giving his otherwise typical actions his motivations, is what elevates the character. It makes every action believable, every opposition to the Doctor that might feel contrived and annoying in another story entirely acceptable, and the wait is not for the inevitable realization the Doctor is alright, but instead for his character to continue on its journey, to make self-realizations about himself, his own biases, and his own loyalties. The realization is not the plot making him think that, it's evidence making it obvious the Doctor is an ally, and Kree Song quickly realizes he is an effective ally in his own goal, to protect the monastery that for him is his life. And indeed, when it feels like the Doctor and co are misusing that trust, his anger comes on that basis, and indeed, when it's time for them all to piss off as part of the Great Intelligence's confusing plan, he resists it because that would be an admission of failure on his part, and abandoning the monastery he has gone so far to protect. It all comes down within the prism of the established character, and that's why it's effective. It gives every action he does and every word he says sense and meaning. His death at the hand of possessed Dabo is the culmination of this. His attempt to confront the true evil at the heart of the monastery, to save it, his monks, his abbot, and his master, and his failure is simply because one man, no matter how determined, was no match for the forces at work. It's a very effective character arc, I think, and Krisong, I think, is definitely a success as a character as a result. So this brings us on to Padmasambhava, the master of the monastery who's been around when the Doctor first visited a few centuries earlier. He's being kept alive by the Great Intelligence to serve its confusing plan. Now, there are 3 reasons I think this character works for me despite the silliness of the plan. Firstly, the fact is someone the Doctor has met before gives the interactions more meaning, as both gives the Doctor a motivation in trying to save someone he knows and respects, fairly obviously why, and it also gives the Doctor's history more richness. It's always something I appreciate when they respect the audience enough to allude to off-screen adventures to give what happens more meaning. A strength of the Celestial Toymaker, for instance, in a story where not everything is a strength, to put it mildly, is the extra weight added by the alluded to previous encounters. Now, admittedly, this one makes a bit less sense, because I'm not sure where the Second Doctor would have found time to have this particular encounter. Given it can't have happened with Jamie, it must have been between the power of the Daleks and the Highlanders, but that's never seemed like a huge gap for me, and it's odd that the Doctor wouldn't have mentioned to Jamie it was something he did with Ben and Polly. Now, the expanded universe seems to think it was the first Doctor who did it. In fact, only around 5 years ago, Big Finish dramatised his initial visits to the monastery with the first Doctor, which I certainly prefer as an idea to this having been with the Second Doctor, although I'd rather it was in that mysterious pre-and-unearthly child time, around the time he met the Toymaker for the first time, than some random adventure he had with Stephen and Dodo, but as it may be. The problem is that does directly contradict this story, where not only is it never mentioned that his appearance have changed, Padmasambhava literally said, "It's good to look on your face again," which implies he instantly recognises the Doctor and would probably have mentioned that his face would have been different. So, who knows what the solution to this particular continuity snarl is, but overall, this previous connection adds depth and richness to the interactions by giving a real sense of camaraderie between these two, and makes Padmasambhava's belief that the Doctor is the key to his salvation all the more believable, even if it doesn't make any sense. Secondly, Padmasambhava is a simple but yet tragic motivation in himself. You can feel throughout the story his utter despair, yet controlled despair, at his withered body being kept alive throughout all the pain and misery that entails just to serve the Great Intelligence. His reaction to it feels so natural and normal, deference at his power that has taken him over, yet pleaded begging just to let him go, and indeed his reaction to finally being allowed to die at the end of the story is by far the best part of the climax. This is a man who we are told is a great man, someone the Doctor truly respected, and yet here we are seeing a power completely wither and destroy him, which lends such depth to the story, both in demonstrating the threat and power of the Great Intelligence, but in making it a more personal concept for conflict for the Doctor. But mostly it's just a tragic, pitiable sight of this great monk withering away under the power. Which is helped by the third thing, that voice. Actor Wolfe Morris had the most difficult job here, to make Padmasambhava both threatening and pitiable, when he himself would only rarely show up on screen, and would never leave the position of sitting on his chair in the sanctum. But my god does he pull it off, the voice he uses is simply incredible. There's the obvious transition between Padmasambhavan's own desperate, pathetic voice of sorrow and the rough, aggressive tones of the Great Intelligence speaking through his voice, the contrast between them being used excellently, especially to heighten the menace of the latter, but even within them there's subtleties. The subtle power the Master has over this monastery, when even in the softer tone, Padmasambhava is obviously a power in his own right when commanding Tomney or Victoria at certain points throughout the story. Yet when he's begging the Great Intelligence, it's the same tone of voice, but so thoroughly changed, becoming pitiful and desperate. Just small changes like that give so much depth to it, and the performance overall is wonderful. As for the Great Intelligence itself, well, I'm not going to spend too long on it for the reason that I already spoke a bit about it earlier, and there's a lot I'm going to say for the Web of Fear. But I think despite the misgivings about its plan, it is a fantastic idea for a villain, and how ill-defined it is very much to its strength. It means that it can be threatening and creepy without going into specifics, let its actions speak for its power rather than anything that has to be explicit. It's maybe let down a little bit by its poor plan, which prevents its motivations from being obvious, but it isn't made up for in how well its possession of Padmasambhava is presented, and the sincerity of its begging and the threat its possessed form gives off. There's no doubt that this thing is very dangerous, and I think the mystery behind it is what gives it even more power. And yes, as I said, giving this thing a body and a voice just to be a normal, sneering villain was one of those egregious attempts of New Who, just not understanding the classic villain it was bringing back, but I digress. But as I said, the nature of the Great Intelligence is something I'll look a bit more in and look at the Web of Fear. Finally, there's the Yeti themselves. Now, obviously they are an iconic villain, despite only ever appearing twice, and I think the idea this well-known folklore creature and turning it on its head with Doctor Who is a sign of the creativity the show could inspire, and it's very notable they stand out on an era when it's happened quite a few times. I already spoke about them in terms of what's on the camera, but what's on the page works brilliantly as well. Turning both the minds of the viewer and the characters, this mysterious creature into this dangerous threat worked well in heightening said threat. This is something that cannot be defeated by conventional means. And yet, turning them into robots, technology therefore, they have an angle of weakness that the Doctor is able to exploit, which I think is a neat way of adding that Doctor Who spin on them. But mostly it's the idea itself. All you need sometimes is an iconic image to make an iconic villain, and the Yeti, both in execution and idea, absolutely managed that. The last thing that isn't to do with the regulars I need to talk about is Travers, the explorer looking for the real Yeti. Never mind that explorers looking for the Yeti or Bigfoot or whatever are far more of a punchline these days than they would have been in the 60s, and never mind that sometimes he feels a bit superfluous to the plot, it's his chemistry with the regulars which is why they brought him back, no doubt helped by the fact he was played by Deborah Watling's father. I will discuss his character in more detail when we look at the Web of Fear, however, so I won't say anything more now. So let's finish up with a look at the regulars. The second Doctor was very well established by this point, and while this doesn't exactly break new ground for him, it very much plays into the strengths of his character. He's dedicated and loyal, and deeply affected by personal relationships, as I said with Padma, but also determined and crafty, and of course happy to play the clown when it suits his needs, innocently tootling on his recorder so he can help draw in the guards so he can present the holy bell to the monks. Or telling Jamie to bung a rock at a Yeti. Stuff like that shows his playful side is always there, but always just a mask or almost a secondary thing he's indulging himself in. What impressed me about the way the second Doctor's character was written in the story was how in control he felt throughout. Not entirely at every moment, of course, but in general he felt like he was on top of it, one step ahead of everyone else, including most of the time the Great Intelligence. And the only vulnerabilities he showed was when he wanted to, his usual obfuscation, or when he was confronting Padma and seeing the state his old friend was in. When, for instance, Victoria was controlled by the Great Intelligence to try and make the Doctor go away, it's notable that the Doctor for a moment didn't fall for it, and I think it's that kind of thing that really helps. And because of the structure of the story, his long absence from the monastery throughout much of it meant that the despair and isolation in the monastery could still come through, despite that control. As for its companions, Jamie is very much his usual self. I'm not sure we would call this a hugely innovative story for him. He was a well-established character by this point, but he shows his bravery, guile, cunning, and indeed his loyalty to the Doctor. But I think the best stuff comes through his interactions with Victoria, and shows her introduction was a huge boon for his character, as it gave his one other person for him to connect with. For him to show off to her by trying to go outside in just a kilt and shirt and having to admit it was a shit idea, or his concern for her out, I like how it's played very subtle and very obvious, he's falling for her, and Hines of course plays it brilliantly throughout. As for Victoria, I think it's clear this was still early days, and as I said earlier, some of the odd out-of-character bits don't help. She was always a bit curious, but never to the extent where it would be to the exclusion of common sense. Her head was screwed on, and frankly, when it wasn't, it was only because of how terrified she was of everything, not because she was overly curious, and I think the story mostly does a good job at demonstrating all that. She's a screamer, of course, but that comes from her background and her provenance. When she's not being confronted head-on by a Yeti, which, to be honest, that sounds like a pretty pants-wetting experience for everyone who's not the Doctor or Jamie, she shows she can be proactive and certainly intelligent. The arc that she goes through throughout her time in the TARDIS, of eventually deciding that the danger and fear was just too much for her to handle, was overall a good one. And while it was very subtle in most stories, it's easy to see how her experience in this story can begin to add up to that conclusion. So yes, while she has her odd bits, and is very much a plot point for certain parts of the story, I think it shows they did want to use this character to her full potential. So overall, the Abominable Snowmen I think is a very good experience. It's thin in places, both in terms of its plot and its content, and the pacing I think does sometimes let it down to the point where it just drags a little, and how much of that is the story being missing I honestly couldn't say. But it's made up for by strong atmosphere and character work, making us believe both the danger these people are in and want to see more from what these people are doing. It's far from flawless, and there are bits I could have done without, not least the white actors playing all the Tibetans, which is a bit unfortunate to say the least. And I think the story does have the unfortunate reputation of always living in the shadow of its sequel, which, yes, is much better, and I'm not sure anyone can make a particularly convincing argument otherwise, although it's Doctor Who, someone could try. But it is on its own a solid story, and one which I think would be better regarded if more of it existed. But unfortunately, that's often the drawback of 60s Who. It's a pity that the Great Intelligence and the Yeti have only been used so sparingly since this season. The Yeti had never returned on TV, and the Great Intelligence only for those few rubbish episodes in the Moffat era where they ignored everything that the Geo-Great Intelligence actually was in the first place. I do wonder if one day we may be able to see them again. And as for the second Doctor, as I said, it's a typical story for him, but shows what he caught on so well. Crafty, cunning, with a bit of humour to lighten things up, and just as capable if not more so than the original incarnation. And with a wonderful performance from the phenomenal actor they had. Thanks to him, the show became immortal. And while this story might not be the best example of why, I think it certainly is a solid one. So I'm giving this story a final score of 6 out of 10. It's slightly above average for Classic Who, and that's a good average to be above, remember. I think it probably needed a bit more of a solid plot and to not drag quite so much to get to a higher score. Those are the two big flaws. But what elevates it is solid character work and great atmosphere, plus a memorable villain and even stuff I didn't mention like entertaining, witty dialogue in a lot of places. Overall, I think it's flawed, but a success despite those, and I will also give Haisman and Lincoln credit for learning from some of the issues here and managing to straighten them out when it came to the sequel a few stories later. Which we'll be getting to soon enough, but over the next few weeks we'll be returning to the Daleks. First in Big Finish with Jubilee, then their first appearance in New Who with Dalek.